mysteriously vanished during a field trip to Everglades National Park. But 48 hours later, a park ranger finds something shocking deep in the swamp, a discovery that reveals the terrifying reality of what happened to the children and who was responsible for their disappearance. Sarah Miller stared at the growing collection of coffee cups littering the small conference room table, each one marking another hour without her son. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that accentuated the dark circles under her eyes. 48 hours. Ethan had been missing for 48 hours now, and every minute felt like an eternity. Her husband Mark sat beside her, his shoulders hunched forward as if carrying a physical weight. His normally immaculate appearance had deteriorated. Stubble darkened his jaw, and his rumpled shirt told the story of 2 sleepless nights spent at the station. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," Detective Garcia said as she entered the room, a fresh stack of papers in her hands. "I know this has been unimaginably difficult, but I want to update you on where we stand." Sarah straightened in her chair, desperate for any news about her 10-year-old son. Ethan was special in every way, not just because he was her child, but because he required special care due to his developmental disabilities. He wore thick glasses that were constantly sliding down his nose, and that morning, the last time she'd seen him, he'd insisted on wearing his favorite orange shirt for the field trip. "Despite mobilizing every available officer and search team in 3 counties, we haven't found any concrete leads yet," Detective Garcia continued, her voice professional but tinged with frustration. "We've been conducting aerial searches. Ground teams are combing every inch of the park, and we've set up checkpoints on all major roads within a 100-mile radius." Mark's hand found Sarah's under the table, squeezing tightly. "How is this possible?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "An entire bus of children doesn't just disappear without a trace?" Detective Garcia nodded toward the whiteboard across the room. 10 children's faces smiled back at them, school photos taken months ago, innocent and unaware of what was to come. Alongside them were photos of Ms. Johnson and Ms. Torres, the 2 female teachers who had accompanied the class on the trip. 12 people had vanished without a trace, and Mr. Wilson, the male teacher, was the only one who made it back. "That's what makes this case so unusual," Detective Garcia admitted. "Let me walk you through the timeline again, just to make sure we haven't missed anything." Sarah's eyes fixed on Ethan's photo as the detective spoke. His crooked smile, those oversized glasses, the cowlick in his hair that never stayed down no matter how much she tried to tame it. The special needs class from Oak Ridge Private Academy left the main visitor center of Everglades National Park at precisely 9:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning, Detective Garcia recited. They boarded a park-owned tour bus with an experienced park employee driving. Mr. Wilson, the male teacher who also works with the class, remained at the visitor center due to limited seating capacity on the bus. "He should have gone instead of one of the other teachers," Sarah interjected, her voice brittle with exhaustion and accusation. "He's stronger. He could have protected them." Detective Garcia continued gently. The bus was scheduled to return after a 3-hour educational tour of the accessible sections of the park. When they didn't return by 12:45 p.m., park staff began radio attempts to contact the driver. After receiving no response for 30 minutes, they dispatched rangers to search the designated tour route. Mark rubbed his face with his free hand and found nothing. "Nothing on the route," Detective Garcia confirmed. "No signs of an accident, no tire marks indicating the bus went off-road. The bus simply wasn't there." Sarah stared at the timeline written on the whiteboard in Detective Garcia's neat handwriting. Each entry marked another moment when her son was slipping further away from her. "If this is a kidnapping, why haven't we received ransom demands?" Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her since the first hours of the disappearance. "Isn't that how these things usually work?" Detective Garcia nodded. "Typically, yes. In most kidnapping cases, perpetrators make contact within 24 hours to capitalize on the initial panic and emotional distress of the families. The fact that we haven't received any demands is unusual. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. If the kidnappers weren't asking for money, what did they want with 10 disabled children? "We've questioned Mr. Wilson extensively," Detective Garcia continued. "Initially, he was our primary person of interest simply because he was the only adult from the school who wasn't on the bus. However, his alibi is airtight. Security footage from the visitor center shows him remaining on the premises the entire time. Multiple witnesses have confirmed he was visibly distraught when the bus didn't return, pacing anxiously and making repeated calls to both teachers' cell phones. Sarah remembered Mr. Wilson from parent-teacher conferences, a kind man in his 40s who had dedicated his career to special education. The thought that he could be involved had never crossed her mind. "We located the tour bus late last night," Detective Garcia said, her tone shifting. Sarah gasped, hope surging through her exhausted body. "And the children?" Detective Garcia's expression told her everything before the words came. The bus was empty. It had been driven approximately 7 miles off the main tour route and partially concealed in a remote area. Our forensics team has been processing it since discovery, and so far we've found no signs of violence or struggle on board. "What does that mean?" Mark asked. "It suggests the children and teachers may have exited the bus voluntarily," Detective Garcia explained, "or they were coerced in a way that didn't result in physical resistance. 10 special needs children wouldn't just calmly walk off a bus in the middle of nowhere," Sarah protested. "Ethan gets anxious in unfamiliar places. Several of the children are nonverbal. At least 3 use wheelchairs full-time." Detective Garcia nodded. "Which is why we believe multiple perpetrators must be involved. This was a carefully planned operation." She walked to the whiteboard and tapped the driver's photo. The park employee driving the bus, Carlos Mendez, has been with the Park Service for 12 years with an impeccable record. We're investigating his background more thoroughly, but at this point, we have to consider the possibility he was either coerced or is involved. "What about connections between the families?" Mark asked. "Could this be targeted at one specific child, with the others taken as collateral?" "We've been interviewing all the families extensively," Detective Garcia confirmed, "looking for any connections, threats, unusual financial activity, anything that might provide a motive. So far, nothing concrete has emerged." Sarah's gaze drifted back to the photos of the children. Each face was familiar to her from school events and playdates at their home. Ethan had struggled to make friends all his life, but in this class he had found true acceptance among peers who understood difference in a way most adults never could. "Perhaps the special needs aspect itself is significant," Mark suggested, his analytical mind still functioning despite his exhaustion. "Oak Ridge Academy's program is exclusive. Tuition runs nearly $40,000 a year. Every family represented here has financial means." Detective Garcia nodded slowly. "That's currently our working theory. The family's collective wealth makes them potential targets for a ransom situation. But without contact from the kidnappers, we're still operating on speculation." Sarah's head throbbed as she tried to maintain her composure. The thought of Ethan somewhere in the vast Everglades, scared and confused without his routine, his medication, or his parents, was unbearable. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In 4 hours at first light, we'll begin a comprehensive grid search of the surrounding wetlands," Detective Garcia explained. "We've called in additional volunteers from neighboring counties, airboats, drones with thermal imaging, and search dogs trained specifically for finding people in swamp conditions. If they're still in the park, we will find them." The "if" echoed in Sarah's mind. If they were still in the park. If they were still alive. If. "Get some rest if you can," Detective Garcia advised gently. "There are cots set up in the break room. We'll wake you immediately if there's any news." Sarah knew she wouldn't sleep, not while Ethan was out there, confused and frightened, wondering why his mother hadn't come to save him yet. The door burst open without warning, causing Sarah to jolt upright from her hunched position. A uniformed officer stood in the doorway, breathing heavily as if he'd run through the station. "Detective Garcia," he said urgently, completely ignoring protocol. "We've got something. Park ranger conducting a preliminary sector search discovered multiple wheelchairs dumped in a remote section of the Everglades." Sarah felt the room tilt slightly. "Wheelchairs?" she repeated, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. The officer's eyes darted to her briefly before returning to Detective Garcia. His hesitation told Sarah everything she needed to know. "And bodies," he said finally, his voice dropping. "2 bodies, ma'am." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath Sarah. Mark's arm immediately went around her shoulders, steadying her. "Are they—" She couldn't finish the question. Detective Garcia was already on her feet, gathering her jacket and radio. "We don't have identifications yet," she said firmly. "Let's not jump to conclusions. I need to get to the scene immediately." "We're coming with you," Mark stated, his tone leaving no room for argument as he helped Sarah to her feet. Detective Garcia shook her head. "This is an active crime scene. I can't allow—" "That's our son out there," Sarah interrupted, suddenly finding her voice. "Either you take us with you, or we'll follow you anyway." Several tense seconds passed before Detective Garcia nodded. "You can follow in your vehicle, but you'll need to remain at a distance from the actual scene. I mean it. You cannot compromise this investigation." Within minutes, a caravan of police vehicles was speeding through the early morning darkness, lights flashing but sirens silent. Sarah and Mark followed in their SUV, the silence between them filled with unspoken terror. Sarah's hand found Mark's on the center console, gripping it with white-knuckled intensity. "It might not be him," Mark said finally, his voice cracking. "We can't assume the worst." Sarah nodded mechanically, but her mind was already racing through worst-case scenarios. Ethan didn't use a wheelchair full-time like some of his classmates, but he sometimes needed one for longer excursions when his balance issues and fatigue became too much. The caravan turned onto an unmarked dirt road that eventually gave way to a crude path barely wide enough for vehicles. Eventually, they reached a point where even the police SUVs could go no further, and they continued on foot. Mark helped Sarah navigate the increasingly muddy terrain as they followed a line of officers through the dense vegetation. The scene unfolded before them as they emerged into a small clearing. Multiple police vehicles had already arrived, their lights casting eerie blue and red patterns across the swamp water. Forensic technicians in white protective suits moved carefully through the area, placing evidence markers and taking photographs. Several uniformed officers maintained a perimeter with yellow crime scene tape. And there, partially submerged in the shallow, murky water, were the wheelchairs. Sarah counted 7 of them, scattered in a rough semicircle. Their colorful frames, pink, blue, green, and purple, stood in stark contrast to the browns and greens of the swamp. Some had clearly been damaged, with bent wheels and broken footrests. Detective Garcia intercepted them before they could get closer. "This is as far as you go," she said firmly, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. Sarah peered past her, scanning the scene desperately. "The bodies?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Detective Garcia's expression softened slightly. "They've already been placed in body bags and are being prepared for transport to the medical examiner's office." Sarah watched as 2 black body bags on stretchers were being carefully carried through the difficult terrain toward the waiting medical examiner's van. One was noticeably smaller than the other. A commotion broke out near the perimeter as another couple pushed past the officers. Sarah recognized them immediately. David and Elizabeth Jacobson, parents of Sophie, a 9-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who was one of Ethan's classmates. "That's Sophie's backpack," Elizabeth screamed, pointing toward a purple backpack with butterfly patches sitting on a tarp with other collected evidence. "That's my daughter's backpack." David Jacobson crumpled to his knees in the mud, a primal sound of grief escaping his throat as officers tried to restrain Elizabeth from crossing into the crime scene. Detective Garcia immediately moved toward them, signaling to her officers to bring the Jacobsons to a more private area, away from the active scene. Sarah watched, frozen in place, as the detective spoke quietly to the couple, her hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. When she returned to the Millers, her face was grave. "I'm sorry you had to witness that. We've made a preliminary identification of one of the victims as Sophie Jacobson, based on personal effects and physical description. The other appears to be Ms. Johnson, one of the teachers." Sarah felt a conflicting wave of emotions, devastating sadness for Sophie and her family, and a shameful relief that it wasn't Ethan. The guilt of that relief hit her immediately, making her nauseous. "How did they—" Mark couldn't finish the question. Detective Garcia glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "The forensic team reports both victims show signs of execution-style gunshot wounds to the head. This wasn't an accident or exposure to the elements. It was deliberate." Sarah swayed slightly, and Mark tightened his grip around her waist. "The wheelchairs appear to have been intentionally damaged," Detective Garcia continued. "This suggests the perpetrators no longer needed them after selecting which victims to keep." The implication was clear. The remaining children were likely still alive, at least for now. "Something's not right about this scene," Sarah said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the wheelchairs. "Look at how they're arranged. They're not just dumped randomly. They're positioned almost deliberately, in a semicircle." Detective Garcia followed her gaze, tilting her head slightly as she considered the pattern. "You're right. This appears staged, like they wanted these chairs to be found." "But why?" Mark asked. "If they're trying to hide their tracks, why create such an obvious scene?" "It could be a message," Detective Garcia speculated, "or a distraction." A man in a medical examiner's jacket approached, nodding respectfully to the Millers before addressing Detective Garcia. "Preliminary time of death estimate puts both victims at approximately 10 to 12 hours ago. They were alive for at least a day after the initial kidnapping." Sarah's mind raced with the implications. If Sophie and Ms. Johnson had been alive until roughly 10 hours ago, that meant the other children, including Ethan, might still be alive. "We need to expand the search," she said urgently. "If they killed these two here, the others might be nearby." "We're already coordinating a wider search pattern," Detective Garcia assured her. "Every available resource is being deployed. Air support will arrive at daybreak for aerial thermal imaging." Mark pulled Sarah closer as they watched the grim work continue around them. The first faint light of dawn was beginning to illuminate the swamp, revealing the full scope of the crime scene. In the distance, they could hear more vehicles arriving, more officers joining the search. "He's still alive," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Mark. "I would know if he wasn't. I would feel it." Mark nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon as the sun began to rise over the Everglades, casting long shadows across the water where the empty wheelchairs stood as silent witnesses to unimaginable cruelty. By mid-morning, the remote crime scene had transformed into a circus of activity. News helicopters circled overhead like vultures, their distant rotors a constant soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. At the main park entrance, a fleet of media vans with satellite dishes extended skyward crowded the visitor parking lot, reporters broadcasting live updates as law enforcement vehicles continued to arrive. The story had exploded across national news networks with the sensational headline, "Disabled Children Kidnapped, 2 Found Dead in Florida Everglades." Every major network had dispatched teams to cover what was quickly becoming one of the most shocking crimes in recent memory. The FBI had officially taken jurisdiction of the case, setting up a command center in the park's main visitor building. Special Agent Daniels, a stern woman in her 40s with short cropped hair and a perpetually furrowed brow, had been appointed lead investigator. She stood before a hastily arranged podium at the media staging area, flanked by local law enforcement and park officials. At approximately 5:42 this morning, search teams discovered the remains of two individuals connected to the Oak Ridge Academy disappearance, Agent Daniels stated, her voice clipped and professional. We can confirm that one victim has been identified as Sophie Jacobson, age 9, and the other as Catherine Johnson, age 34, a teacher at the academy. Due to the ongoing nature of this investigation and out of respect for the families, we will not be sharing details about the condition of the remains or cause of death at this time. Reporters shouted questions simultaneously, creating a cacophony of voices. Is this being investigated as a terrorist incident? Were ransom demands made before the killings? Are there suspects in custody? What about the other children? Are they believed to be alive? Agent Daniels raised her hand for silence. We are pursuing multiple leads and utilizing every resource available to locate the remaining children and teacher. We ask anyone with information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, to contact the FBI tip line immediately. We have reason to believe. A police communications officer approached the podium hurriedly, interrupting by handing Agent Daniels a folded note. The agent read it quickly, her expression unchanging save for a slight tightening around her eyes. This press conference is concluded. We will provide updates as the investigation progresses. Thank you. Ignoring the renewed barrage of questions, Agent Daniels strode quickly back toward the visitor center, where the Millers and other parents of the missing children had gathered in a private room, anxiously awaiting news. When Agent Daniels entered, the room fell instantly silent. 8 sets of parents sat in uncomfortable chairs arranged in a loose circle, some holding hands, others sitting in isolated bubbles of grief. The Jacobsons were noticeably absent, having been taken to a separate location to formally identify their daughter and begin the devastating process of making arrangements. We've received a ransom demand, Agent Daniels announced without preamble, her direct approach a stark contrast to Detective Garcia's more empathetic style. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The demand came via email approximately 15 minutes ago, sent to the school administrator's official address, Agent Daniels continued. The message demands $2 million in cash within 24 hours for the safe return of the remaining children and Ms. Reyes. Let me see it, demanded James Whitaker, father of twins, Ryan and Tyler, both missing. A successful investment banker, he had been increasingly combative with authorities as the hours passed without progress. Agent Daniels hesitated, then turned a tablet to face the parents. The email was displayed on screen, its clinical language at odds with the horror it contained. We have your children, Sophie Jacobson and Catherine Johnson, were eliminated to demonstrate our resolve. The remaining hostages will be released upon receipt of $2 million in unmarked bills. You have 24 hours. Further instructions will follow confirmation of your agreement to these terms. Each 12-hour period without compliance will result in another elimination. The wealthy families of Oak Ridge Academy can certainly afford this small price for their children's lives. Below the text was a photo showing the 8 remaining children and Ms. Reyes huddled together in what appeared to be a dimly lit room with concrete walls. They were sitting on the floor, some leaning against each other for support. Though the image was slightly blurry, Sarah immediately spotted Ethan in his orange shirt, his glasses missing and his face tear-streaked but undeniably alive. "Ethan," she whispered, reaching toward the screen before pulling her hand back. He looked terrified, but physically unharmed from what she could tell. The timing of this demand is significant, Agent Daniels said. It came immediately after news of the discovered bodies reached the media. The perpetrators were clearly waiting for public confirmation of the killings to maximize the psychological impact of their demand. "Do they think we won't pay?" Rebecca Chen asked incredulously. Her daughter Lily, who had Down syndrome, was barely visible in the corner of the ransom photo. "I'll sell my house today if I have to." The email also contained an appendix with specific information about each family's financial status, Agent Daniels continued. stock portfolios, real estate holdings, business valuations. Details that